we are back up and running. Teachers and staff, please know that it's going to take a little bit for everything to boot back up. I'm still waiting on my email to come back in calendars, so announcements won't have quite as much information, which may be a blessing for some of you. So if you could please rise for the pledges. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And now the Texas Pledge. Honor the Texas flag. I pledge allegiance to thee, Texas, one state under God, one and indivisible. If you could please remain standing for this moment of silence. Okay, normally at this time we're scanning our first period class for any student out of dress code and without an ID on. We're giving you a little bit of grace today, but if you don't have that, tomorrow we need you to have that back on tomorrow. We're back on.
Oh no, no grace on that.
Getting your ID on and making sure that you're in dress code. A couple of announcements from Mike Moore. If you haven't read it, you probably do need to read it. There's a lot of information and always the deadlines in there that you need to have. First and foremost, I'd like to share a quote from a famous Black American for Black History Month. Success is to be measured not so much by the position that one has reached in life, as by the obstacles which he has overcome while trying to succeed. Booker T. Washington. As we've seen, tough times never last, but tough people do, and we have a lot of tough Longhorns out there. And Mother Nature tested a lot of toughness out of us this time. And as one of the families that had no electricity or water until Thursday and Friday, I was trying to find some silver linings in that. So the silver lining that I made out of most everything was that I'm thanking my lucky stars for all our CTE programs we offer in George Ranch and across this district. We're producing essential workers for tough times like we've gone through. We have plumbers and carpenters, drywallers, welders, and electricians, just to name a few. Four-year colleges are not for everyone, but everyone will need these types of services from these experts when a crisis happens. So shout out to our CTE grads and teachers out there. We are so proud and thankful for each of you. Okay, a couple of things that are coming up this week. Since we were closed last week and it was the end of the 4-6 week, LCISD has let us push it back for 1 week. So the last day of the 4-6 weeks is going to be this Friday, February 26th. So everything that was due last week, if you were getting Canvas notifications and due dates, don't worry about that. Those are getting pushed to this week. But you do need to get those wrapped up for this week because the 5-6 weeks is going to start on Tuesday, March 2nd. Yes, that's right. Tuesday, not Monday, March 2nd. So if you choose to go virtual, that's the day this will happen. So if you chose virtual for the 5-6 weeks, March 2nd is the day this will start. So you need to continue joining us until through Monday of next week if you chose to go virtual. Cheer trials for March 11th. Girls and boys swim is heading to state March 1st and 2nd. They pushed that back. And seniors, lots of updates in there and deadlines, especially through cap and gown is March 1st deadline. You need to get those orders so you can get those cap and gowns in early in April. Tonight, I believe, if this is correct, we have baseball here at varsity at Longhorn baseball field.
No.
So tonight, baseball versus Pearland.
Nope.
I believe that's
No,
it we have for today. We love you and have a marvelous Monday. And remember, if you can't be kind, then be quiet.
Okay, quickly. So obviously everything that was supposed to be done last week is gone, right? There were no due dates, no assignments, no nothing. Lone Star shut down for the entire week as well. I'll be honest with you, I don't really care if Lone Star had shut down or not. We would have shut down because this is one of those great things where you get sort of the benefit of whichever side, right? If Lone Star shuts down and LCISD doesn't, I'm probably shutting down. If LCISD shuts down and Lone Star doesn't, I'm shutting down. So, here's the deal. This is chapter 22. This is the last chapter for this test. You were originally scheduled to take a test on Friday on that half day, which is miserable. That's not happening. Okay? One, the half day is gone. Two, you will now test on Wednesday. Okay, so we'll take a quiz. The quiz has already been moved in D2L. So the quiz is due today. We're going to lecture today. The test will be on Wednesday. Short response number 8 has been axed. It's gone. Okay, that was originally due last Wednesday, I believe, or Thursday, or whatever day it was. It was originally due last week. Okay, little disappointed. It's actually about like trench warfare, which obviously is my background in the Marine Corps and the military. Like, I tend to enjoy military history. So you're welcome to like look up some of that on your own if you would like, but we're going to move on. All right. So, why does this do this to me? Wait, now it's okay. We're going to see. All right, here we go. So this is World War I, right? We call it World War I now. In like 1920, it was literally called the war to end all wars. People thought that this was so catastrophic, and it was. Make no mistake about it. World War I is utterly horrific. Okay, in terms of like violence and gore and death, it's probably the worst war in the history of the world. Okay, in part because of new technologies, in part because there were I don't want to say less morals, right? But like, let's put it this way: there were less rules, right? Like if you actually become like a history major, and you want to look at sort of like global history and global interactions, or if you decide to major in poli-sci, political science, and you want to look at like international relations, the Geneva Convention, which is established after World War II, is a great like place to go and look, because literally the Geneva Convention put rules on warfare, made it a game. There's rules now, right? Like, oh, you can't. If somebody has the little red cross, right? They're medical personnel, can't shoot them. They're allowed to have a gun and they can shoot at you, but you can't shoot at them, right? Doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? Okay. In World War I, we are way ahead of any of these curves, and to where things like mustard gas, which is it's chemical warfare. And you don't know what chemical warfare is. There's three categories of like catastrophic warfare in the military: nuclear, biological, and chemical. They're basically outlawed now as a result of the Geneva Conventions. Mustard gas is chemical warfare that's used during World War I. Because why wouldn't you use it? If you have a tool that will kill your enemy quicker at war, that's probably a good thing. Okay. So I need you to understand that before war breaks out, though, right? Like we're going to back up a little bit. Before the war breaks out, Europe is already almost on the brink of war as it is. Okay. For a number of reasons. One, you had what is called militarism, right? So militarism, and we saw it in the United States too, right? You remember Teddy Roosevelt and his massive navy, right? Walk softly but carry a big stick. Same thing going on in Europe. People are building up the military for the sake of building up the military as a sign of strength. The problem is that when you look at international relations, right? And if you really got into like foreign policy and international relations at like a college level, right? When somebody else builds up their military, you're sort of forced to build up yours in response because you don't know what their end game is. You don't know what their goals are. You don't know whether they're going to be rational or irrational, right? So you have to have a proportional response. So if Canada were to build up its navy, right, or excuse me, build up its army, right, and literally deploy a whole bunch of Canadian troops along the Canadian border, the U.S. would have to match that. We would be forced to, even though you're not in war. Okay, like this is something that happened in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, forever, right? U.S. Marines basically just lined up around a fence, and then there was a Cuban counterpart on the other side of the fence, and they just stared at each other and pointed guns at each other, and nobody ever shot. Because nobody wanted to shoot first, because then you actually start a war, right? But you pointed a gun at me, so I pointed a gun at you, and then we just stared at each other for 8 hours until our shift ended and then somebody replaced both of us. Okay? So that's the idea of militarism that's happening in Europe in the early 1900s. Okay? Additionally, within the 1900s, we have all sorts of alliances, right? And these permanent alliances are furthering some of the conflicts and the issues, right? The orangish color that's up there are what we call the Central Powers. The greenish colors are what we call the Allied powers. But basically what you have is you have a whole bunch of countries that are aligned with one another through these sort of permanent treaties. And if you go back to first semester, we talked about this with George Washington, right? Washington warns about permanent alliances. He thinks they're a terrible thing, and they probably are. Okay? Because literally what happens now is you basically have like a gang fight, right? So two people get into a fight, right? But then because of these alliances, well, oh, my boy got hit, so now I got to go get into it. Well, now it's not fair because it's 2-on-1, so I'm gonna come get in on this side until you literally have the entirety of Europe essentially joining into this conflict, all because they got to help their boys that they've pledged their allegiance to, almost in this like pseudo gang sense. All right, so that's sort of the idea there. Okay, the major aspect here of World War One, that one, like I said, it's we call it global, but that's really sort of like ethnocentric, because obviously there's not a lot of fighting in Asia or Africa or even South America. We call it a global war because obviously in terms of like white history, Europe is the center of the world. So take that with a little bit of a grain of salt, but it is a global conflict in the fact that you do have imperialist nations that are European at the time, like England and Italy, and so there are skirmishes that occur elsewhere. I think Somalia is a decent example because literally at one point in time in history, there's Dutch Somalia, Italian Somalia, and English Somalia, I think. Right? Like literally Somalia is broken into 3 different countries that are literally have like the white overlords attached to the name. Okay. Trench warfare is a relatively new strategy in terms of combat. Again, if you go back and you look at like the Civil War, if you look at a lot of other conflicts, land wars were generally 2 armies sort of meeting on an open field and then just stupidly, and I mean this when I say like stupidly, just shooting each other until one side falls down. Like just idiotic. It's asinine. Dumbest way ever to fight a war, right? Trench warfare, and that's what your short response would have been about. Trench warfare is the idea that you basically dig, and when I say trenches, I mean like 6-foot trenches. They were so complex that they had like wood floors. Right? Now some of that was out of necessity because obviously you dig a big trench, right? And then there's rain. Where does all the water go? Down into the trench, right? So then you had a lot of mud down there. Okay? And then obviously you don't have like, the 2 things that dry out the ground, right? Sun and wind. We don't get any wind down in the trench, right? And because you dug it down so deep, you only get really sunshine inside the trench when the sun is at like its peak position. Okay? So the wood floors are actually in part just to make it a little bit more feasible to walk and do things like that. But the trenches stretch miles. They're incredibly elaborate. You have like concertina wire, barbed wire, sort of coiled barbed wire that's laid out in front, so that way somebody can't like crawl across the ground in the middle of the night and crawl into your trench and kill you, right? Because they have to get through that and make noise. They actually called the area in between the 2 trenches no man's land. It was terrible. Like if you jumped up and tried to run that quarter mile, because it's probably what it was, maybe not even a quarter mile, right? you're definitely going to get mowed down. Like you were not going to make it. All right, because another sort of technological advancement at the time is machine guns, right? I'm not saying machine guns first began in like the 1870s or 1860s, but like the water-cooled Browning machine gun of World War One is a lot more transportable. Like old school machine guns, you had to like carry them on a cart, like with horseback. Now you have machine guns that can basically carry by like a fire team by like 4 dudes, right? They carry like the barrel and the base and the ammunition, and then like an extra barrel usually. Okay. So obviously you set those machine guns up top of the trench, and then if somebody tries to run that quarter mile, like you just mow them down with a machine gun, because yeah. All right. So that's some of the aspects here of the the conflict that's actually going on in Europe. Initially, America wants out. They don't want any part of this. Okay. Initially, the U.S. doesn't want any part of the actual warfare. We don't want to go to Europe, right? Woodrow Wilson is president in 1913, right? He's elected in 1912. He runs for re-election in 1916, and literally his whole campaign slogan is, "I kept you out of the war." Right? Like, hooray, I'm awesome. I kept you out of the war. We didn't go to war. Re-elect me because I'm doing a good job. Right? I didn't get you killed. He then wins re-election and then goes immediately to war. Maybe necessarily. We can talk about that in a second. But the U.S. also is absolutely going to get involved. Right? We don't want to send any troops. We don't want to be involved in the actual warfare. But you know what war is a great opportunity for? Making money. Oh yeah. You want to get rich? Go somewhere where there's a war. Seriously. Go somewhere where there's a war. Especially if you like don't care, but especially if you don't care. Man, you just be selling weapons to both sides. Let them kill each other. I don't care. I'm gonna get rich. Right? The U.S. is helping to fund the war because the U.S. is helping to supply the war. Okay? So the U.S. is absolutely involved in that regard because it is an economic opportunity. Okay? Ultimately, with World War One, there's supposed to be some basic ground rules for civility. Again, I'm gonna be honest with you. Like I'm gonna tell it to you. Like I think World War One is exactly what war should be. Okay, and that's just my personal opinion. So literally, when you talk about neutral rights and submarines, right? Like we have submarines at this point. Neutral rights is basically the idea the United States is neutral in the war. If they're sending supplies to England, that is a civilian vessel. It is not a military vessel. It's just supplies going to England. You don't attack them, right? The Germans with their little submarines are like, we're gonna blow that ship up anyway. Why? Because in reality, if you want to win a war, you got to disrupt supply lines. You can't allow the supply lines to continue and be like, oh, well, that's an American ship, and they're not really involved in the war. No, look, dude. If I gave Nico a gun and then Nico killed somebody, right? Am I liable for that death legally? Yes. Yes, I am. Like legally, I can be charged with murder. Right? So if the United States is giving England guns and tanks and ammunition, and England is using that to kill Germans, is the United States killing Germans? Yeah, kind of. In which case, should the Germans be allowed to blow up American ships? Probably. Okay? I mean, that's warfare. If you don't like it, don't get involved. And then when I say don't get involved, I mean like truly, don't get involved. Okay? You can't be over there trying to profit off of it, making money off of it, and then be like, no. Okay, you got involved. All right. Ultimately, what does end up happening is two things. One, the Zimmerman telegram, which is basically a ploy by the Germans to occupy American forces, and then the sort of unrestricted submarine warfare that the Germans are engaging in. At that point, U.S. sailors, right, not Navy, like not military personnel, but just U.S. citizens, right, that are on ships, on transportation ships, are being killed as a result of this war. At that point, that's an attack on American soil, yada, yada, yada. You got to defend yourself. So that, and then the Zimmerman telegram are going to be the two sort of straws that break the camel's back that does push us into the war in 1917. Okay. But again, I need you to understand this, right? Because in U.S. history, we talk, oh, World War I was from 1917 to 1919. No. It was from 1914 to 1919. We just got in late. Okay. We don't do the same thing with World War II. All right. But the Zimmerman telegram is this idea where the Germans send a telegram to the Mexicans, right? And they're like, hey, we want you to attack the United States. So that way the U.S. stops sending supplies to Europe. And then, like, y'all can be in your own little war. And then the Germans are like, when we win over here and we beat all these people up, then we're going to come down there to Mexico and we're going to help you beat up the Americans. And then you can get back all that land that you lost in the Spanish-American War. And you can have California back and Texas back and yada, yada, yada. Right? That telegraph is actually intercepted, right? So it's like intercepted, decoded. And at that point, the U.S. realizes that you kind of have to go. That leads to a massive recruitment effort, right? Because the U.S. does not have a large standing military. Okay? There's been no need for a large standing military in the United States up to this point. Okay? So you're going to have to massively increase the number of people that serve. Okay? And then that creates other problems at home. Okay? So now, amongst the various problems that you have at home, okay, is you end up with issues over what are you going to do? Like once you conscript all the men, right? Conscript just means like draft, like take them into service. Once all the men go to work, who's working in the factories? Ladies, you up, right? Okay. Why do you think, and we'll get to this when we get to the 1920s and 1930s, why do you think in the 1920s women were upping? Right? Like women, no, that's later. Okay? Women are problems in the 1920s, right? Because oh my God, women want to go to bars and they want to drink and they want to take like birth control and they want to like, oh my God, they want to make their own decisions in life. Like these uppity women, how dare they? Right? Why did women think that they could do all of this? Because when you took all the men to war, the women just ran everything in the country, right? The women went to work and did man's work, right? Like they built munitions in factories. Do you have any idea how dangerous it is to build munitions? Right? Like it's dangerous today. Imagine how it was a century ago when you didn't have some of the same things that we have today, right? Y'all heard in the news, what was it, 4 days ago, about the explosion in the Middle East at the bomb making class? No, so y'all got to read the news a little bit, right? Like 30 people died in an explosion at a mosque where they were learning how to make bombs. Of course, because what do bombs do? They explode, right? That's what munitions are. Okay? Like literally, you're talking about a factory that has a whole bunch of like primers and gunpowder and munitions and like projectiles. Like if you drop a bomb, right? Like after you put it together and then you're carrying it somewhere and then you drop it, right? And somehow like the primer ignites, man, you all gone. Just go ahead and kiss your butt goodbye. Right? Because the one explosion is then going to ignite all the gunpowder that's in the facility, the whole building going up, right? Okay? Just try to put this in perspective. What was it, like 6 years ago? Did y'all hear about the explosion at the fertilizer plant here in Texas? Y'all remember that? Right? Fertilizer is something that's used in munitions. Yeah, highly combustible. And so, like they weren't even making bombs there. They were literally making fertilizer. And what happened? Little tiny fire broke out, and then boom, whole factory goes up. Okay? Same sort of concept. So women kill it. Like they're killing it. Okay? They go to work and they do everything, and then the men come back in 1919 and they look at the women and they're like, take your butt back to the kitchen, girl. How do you think that goes over with women? Not well. Not well at all. Okay? Anytime you're at war, and we'll see this a little bit more in World War II, only because Dr. Seuss gets involved in it, which is always entertaining, right? So have y'all seen the Dr. Seuss like political cartoons? I can't wait to show you that when we get to World War II. Like literally, Dr. Seuss gets into the war effort and tells you like go kill Nazis. In like Dr. Seuss rhymes with the weird characters. It's awesome. Okay. But you do absolutely have war propaganda that's occurring throughout the United States, right? You've got to get support for the war. You've got to get people on board. You got to get people to buy in. You got to get people to do what is necessary. Because here's the other thing. When you go to a war of that nature, right, and you see the same thing with World War II, you've never seen it in your lifetime, and you probably never will because the U.S. military doesn't really go to war anymore. Like we just go to policing conflicts and get our butts kicked. Okay? But in a real war, like you can't get things. You can't find things. And when I say you can't get things, you can't find things. Like in World War II, the United States ran out of steel. They ran out. Didn't have none. Right? Like you couldn't go to the grocery store and get a can of green beans. Wasn't no cans. Right? You couldn't get silk for like clothing because all the silk was being used for parachutes. Like in a real war, that's what happens. And so the propaganda is actually important because it matters. Because if you, like you here at home, right, like you have to change your life because Americans are dying in Europe. That sucks for you, right? And it's really hard. It's really hard to be like, well, why do I like I'm not at war. Like, what? Nothing should change for me, man. Like, I just want to live my life, right? Like, that is a common sort of belief, right? That's a common ideal. And so the propaganda is really important, not just like, we're not talking about propaganda on the actual war front. Like, those people know why they're there and what they're doing and the importance of it. I'm talking about like at home so that you get people to continue to support them. And so that you get younger men, right? Like 16, 17-year-olds that are growing up that are like, hey, I can't wait till I can join. Like, I'm gonna go lie and say I'm 18 right now and go to the service because that happens, right? Because like people didn't really have birth certificates back then. You do have some loss of civil liberties at the time, which is probably not the best thing, but obviously the U.S. is in the market for taking away civil liberties at least from time to time. Those two cases right there are about losses of civil liberties. Schenck, for instance, is a free speech, freedom of press, First Amendment case in which you're basically losing your freedom of speech. Schenck is a communist, right? He's advocating basically for like communism in the United States, doesn't want us to be involved in the war, wants like the workers of the world to unite and rise up, yada, yada. Okay. Eugene Debs is a socialist leader who ends up running for president like 5 different times, once while he's actually in prison, which is kind of entertaining. If you like the history of socialism and communism, Debs is a decent guy to look into. But the United States outlaws some of that speech because it's detrimental to the war effort, it's detrimental to the nation, and so they are going to limit some of that stuff. Okay? Again, there's issues with immigration and immigrants coming into the U.S. Again, because at this time, we don't want immigrants, especially immigrants that are like fleeing Europe, because it's where our immigrants come from, right? Because we don't want non-white immigrants really at this point, right? But we also don't want like these white folks fleeing Europe and then coming here and being like, no, don't support the war. War is bad. It killed my family. I lost my home, right? Like we don't need that kind of dissent. We don't need that kind of outcry against sort of the morality and the ideals of the United States as we're in this conflict. And so that is fairly significant in terms of what's going on, right? So basically, if you want to get in here, you have to not only sort of prove that you are educated, intelligent, valuable, worthy, but there's some sort of quid pro quo aspect to it, where you're looking at which nations we're allowing to come in and whether or not those people sort of have the American ideals. Does that make sense? You know what I mean when I say like American ideals? Like think the way that we do. Like basically, we need people to come and assimilate to U.S. culture and U.S. ideology, right? America's role in the war itself. So one, if you go back to that very first map, right, you realize that the Central Powers are kind of boxed in on both sides, yes? Because you have Russia on the western side, and then you have like France on the eastern side. France and the eastern side is really where that trench warfare is, that terrible, terrible trench warfare. On the east, the Central Powers are fighting the Russians, and you don't ever want to get into a war with Russia. Right? Because there's one thing Russia has that greatly exceeds basically every other country, and that's cannon fodder. You know what cannon fodder is? People. Like literally when Russia goes to war, they just take their little peasants, right? They're serfs that are essentially slaves. They're not slaves, but they're kind of like slaves. But they're a lower caste. They have a caste system. Do we know what a caste system is? No? A caste system is like a hierarchical system, like here's the rich folks, and here's the middle class folks, and here's the poor folks. Except the difference is, like we have that in America, right? But the difference is you poor in America, like theoretically, you can become rich, right? In countries with a caste system, like if you are born into this caste, like that's it. You ain't moving. That's it. Right? And so that bottom caste, those serfs, Russia can just send them to the front line in like massive waves, which allows them to be sort of a prominent military adversary. Except, as I'm sure you can imagine, if you just send a whole bunch of like poor kids to the front line and get them killed, what do you think the other poor kids are eventually going to do? You think they're just going to stand there and wait until they turn 16 and be like, oh, guess it's my turn to go? Like literally, I need you to understand, like Russia literally in World War II, Russia will send kids to the front line without a gun, without boots, without a winter coat. Like literally, they just round you up, no training, hop on a train and go to Ukraine. I mean, it's so but like, hey, here you go. Right? And then you get off the train and they look at you and they be like, what size boots you wear? 10s. Okay. That dude over there that's dead, he got 10s on. Go take his boots. Right? You can go ahead and have his rifle too, because obviously he ain't using it no more. And y'all look about the same size. Go ahead and take his winter coat. Right? And then you like take his winter coat on, like, dude, there's a bullet hole in it. That's some blood. That's all right. You'll be fine. It's your winter coat now. Like, would you be like, hey, that's what I want to do in life? No, right? So ultimately, it's during World War I that we have the Bolshevik Revolution, which is the communist revolution in Russia. And So in 1917, Vladimir Lenin is going to revolt against Tsar Nicholas. Tsar is basically the Russian word for king. And they take over, basically kill the royal family in Russia, and take over. And once the communists take over in Russia, they're going to cease operations. They basically end the Western Front. They're like, we're out, we're done. We're not sending any more of our people, right? Like our people to go die in your godforsaken war. We're out, right? Which is part of the reason why the U.S. really needed to get in when it did. Otherwise, the Central Powers might have had a little bit more, what's the word I'm looking for? Might have had a little bit more opportunity to be successful. Okay. The end of the war, as the war ends, right? And the Western Front is obviously where the U.S. fights, right? So that's like Western Europe is France and England, and then Eastern Europe is Russia. The Western Front is obviously where the U.S. fights, and that's, like I said, where the trench warfare is. There's a novel, and I forget the name of the author now, All Quiet on the Western Front, that's written about this and sort of the war experience. But as the United States arrives, and the United States brings with it a fair amount of infrastructure, everything from like tiny trains, like they lay track for like little trains for like transportation, for resupply. Ultimately, the wave of Americans coming in is going to help push the tide and move those trenches further and further back, ultimately allowing for the Allies to gain enough ground to sort of force the Central Powers into surrender. When that happens, Woodrow Wilson, our president, is a relatively prominent figure in that. He creates his 14 points, which is basically like the peace agreement. Amongst those 14 points is actually something called the League of Nations, which is a precursor to the United Nations. And ultimately, we don't join. Our Senate and Henry Cabot Lodge prevents the U.S. from joining the League of Nations. Now, even if the U.S. had joined the League of Nations, I'm going to be honest with you, the League of Nations was doomed anyways because Germany was not allowed to join. Like, you can't really have a League of Nations and be like, hey, here's all the countries, you can't come, right? Even though Germany is probably ultimately responsible for World War I, right? Like, y'all learned in a world history class how it actually went down, right? No? Y'all didn't take world history? You don't have to take world history anymore. Okay, so the way it actually goes down, right, is you have the Archduke of Austria who's assassinated by some like Serbian, and Serbians are sort of similar to Russians, and Austria had an alliance with Germany. And so basically Austria, because they're like heir to the Austrian throne, was assassinated. They put a bunch of demands on the Serbians and like, here's what you have to do in order for us to forgive you. And literally the demands are like impossible. It's impossible. Like the Serbians were never going to be able to do that, which then like leads to war. And then the Russians are like, well, you're not treating the Serbians fairly, even though they did assassinate your dude. And so then Russia gets in, and then Germany gets in with Austria, and then we just have to build up from there. Okay. But yeah, so that is what it is. Obviously within, excuse me, within warfare, you do have some like, you know, heroes that come about as a result of this. York is a decent, or is a pretty good example. So ultimately, this is a guy who sort of personifies the American fighting spirit. He's in the Argonne Forest, which is now I mean, it's sort of legend in terms of where the terrible fighting went on there. But ultimately, he's a Medal of Honor recipient for his sort of heroism. And if you ever really get into military history, reading Medal of Honor recipient like commendations can actually be pretty interesting. I mean, you have somebody that that holds a position against overwhelming odds. I think he like single-handedly killed like 35 Germans or something like that and captured like another 100, essentially all by himself while wounded. Like kind of amazing in that regard. Okay. Ultimately, the end of the war occurs along the Western Front. The Allies begin that massive campaign. We're actually getting out of the trenches, trying to move forward, gain ground, because in reality, what you had for a long time was just a stalemate. And so it was kind of easy to maintain war while you had this trench warfare, because essentially you just kind of pop up, like stand up, fire off a couple of rounds, and then jump back down into your trench. And then the other side would do that, and nobody would hit anybody, and nobody died. When nobody's dying in war is kind of easy to continue. Like, yeah, it sucks. Like, it sucks sleeping outside, and it sucks like sleeping in the rain and the snow, and like, but hey, so long as you ain't dying, it ain't that bad. You know what I'm saying? Ultimately, though, the U.S. As they come and join the Allies along this Western Front, and they begin gaining territory, the Germans, sort of put some new people in charge that seek peace, and so really, like Germany sort of collapses. You have the armistice, which is obviously what Veterans Day is now. If you didn't know that, that's where Veterans Day comes from. It used to be called Armistice Day. Did you know that? No? It used to be called Armistice Day, which is the end of World War I. Now we just call it Veterans Day because obviously there's a lot more wars after World War I. The German collapse is highly problematic because it's ultimately going to lead to some situations that sort of expedite World War II. And we'll get to that when we get to World War II and how sort of the collapse of Germany and then the reparations put upon them, like the terms of the peace agreement, really sort of expedited opportunities for somebody like Hitler to rise to power and for Germany to come back to what it was. Obviously, this becomes a huge celebration. The war is over. We obviously are thrilled that the war is over. You had a significant number of casualties. And so then this brings us to sort of the politics of peace, right? And how once war ends, you have to figure out what you're trying to do in this regard in order to finish the war, right? Because wars really aren't over until you have your peace agreements, okay? Wilson goes to Europe. The treaty is actually signed in Versailles, which is in France. You have essentially these four people. So Wilson, I'm not going to try to say the French dude's name there because I don't speak French. George is the Prime Minister of England, and so these are the guys that are ultimately trying to hammer this peace agreement out. The Europeans basically want to see Germany really punished and punished hard for what happened. Again, there's a lot of animosity and a lot of bitterness toward this whole conflict. A whole bunch of people died. In reality, probably unnecessarily. I mean, Europe had been sort of on the brink of war for years and years and years because of these permanent alliances and militarism and nationalism and things like that that aren't great. They're not ideal. But the Europeans within the peace agreement really want to see significant punishments heaped upon the Germans And so ultimately they're sort of successful in that regard. They get they allow for that. They allow for Germany to be very, very for the peace agreement to be very, very punitive towards Germany. Wilson, because obviously he's traveling in Europe at the time, and he's there for an extended period of time. And then obviously this is 100 years ago, so it's not like you have cell phones and internet and cable television. There are some that believe that Wilson kind of loses touch with the American people, that he doesn't really understand what's going on domestically. And so a lot of what he negotiates, you'll learn this next year when you get into government, presidents negotiate treaties, but treaties have to be actually approved by the U.S. Senate. And so when Wilson returns, I told you a minute ago, Henry Cabot Lodge and some of the others are actually adamantly opposed to some of the things that Woodrow Wilson has advocated for and done, namely the League of Nations. The U.S. sees the League of Nations as being sort of a permanent alliance entity, which is obviously one of the causes of World War I. And so the U.S. wants no part of it. The U.S. wants no part of a permanent alliance with European countries, so that if they go to war with one another again, the U.S. is automatically forced into that war as a result. I mean, Wilson tries to get the actual U.S. people on his side, but ultimately he fails. Wilson is unable to garner enough support for the U.S. involvement in the League of Nations. And so there are some people will sort of argue that the U.S.'s lack of involvement in the League of Nations is sort of the cause of World War II and why the League of Nations failed. There's probably some truth to that. I will be honest with you. I will argue that the League of Nations was sort of doomed to fail anyways. Following the Treaty of Versailles, Europe looks drastically different. So if you were to compare, the first map, right, where you had like the Austrian-Hungary Empire and sort of the German Empire, like the new map creates new countries, creates new territories, new boundaries, all sort of aimed at trying to bring about some better peace agreements. It's probably worth noting, and my guess is you've actually heard of this now, because COVID-19 has been compared to the Spanish flu frequently. The Spanish influenza pandemic, right? And it is a pandemic. Begins in I believe it was 1918, in the middle of World War I. And it's I mean, we call it the Spanish flu because Spain is where we ultimately realize that that strand of the flu is what's so catastrophic. In reality, it was probably already on the front lines in World War I, because obviously you have way worse hygiene in the front lines, and you're not showering, and it's way worse. There were definitely, like, anytime you go to war, disease kills as many people as warfare does frequently. But obviously the Spanish flu was significant in terms of a catastrophic world event, and it killed like a massively high percentage of the population. Again, domestically, once you get back, I told you earlier when we were talking about sort of women and women going into the workforce. Once women have proven their worth, not that they probably should have had to, but they have, they're obviously not willing to just sort of go quietly into the night back into the kitchen and do nothing other than, sort of cook, clean, and raise children. And so World War I does become sort of an opportunity for women. They do get the right to vote right afterwards. But there are some other issues with that in terms of general economics and how trying to reintegrate the men into manufacturing jobs and the labor of the workforce, how that affects it. You've got a whole bunch of people that are now, looking at sort of the success of the Bolshevik Revolution, which is going to lead to some instances of I don't want to call them like labor riots, but I mean strikes at least. Labor disrest, let's call it that, where people are going to walk off the job, mass protests, mass strikes. You're talking about like hundreds of thousands of people within an individual industry that walk off the job at the same time together. When 100,000 people do that, and sometimes it was more, they wield a significant amount of power. Additionally, at home, you do get some other conflicts. So we have some race riots. As a result, you have the first Great Migration that occurs roughly around this time. So again, you had a lot of blacks didn't necessarily have the same opportunities in the military that whites did during World War I, but they do have opportunities in terms of the labor force, right? So we know that a lot of black men have sort of been stuck in the South. World War I provides them with an opportunity to get out because they can now move up to the North and go to work in factories and make a decent wage and a decent like living. But again, once whites come back, like they want black people to go back to being second-class citizens as well. Like they're not okay with the fact that their job now belongs to a black man, right? When they just went and put their life on the line, yada yada yada. So you do have some significant race relation issues. And again, if we had more time, I would love to go into like the Haymarket race riot. There you will, because I won't cancel this. There is a short response on sort of the Black Wall Street massacre next week, because that happens in the 1920s, so it's technically in the next unit. We also have the first Red Scare in the United States. Obviously, again, communism is deemed at this point to be successful. There's a successful communist revolution in Russia, and so there's a legitimate fear that the U.S. could be next. Karl Marx, who's the philosopher behind communism, right? He wrote the Communist Manifesto. He's German, wrote it in the mid-1800s, believed that communism was actually an inevitability and that it would ultimately go everywhere, that there was no other option because eventually labor, which grossly exceeds capital, would rise up and overthrow capital. You know what capital is? Nico, any idea what capital is? Capital? Money, okay? Money, resources, non-labor stuff, okay? There's a lot more labor than there is like money, okay? So rich people's money is not going to supersede poor people's labor, according to Marx, because there's just more poor people. So he actually thought that that was an inevitability anywhere. And a lot of Americans are afraid of it. They're terrified of it, okay? We were our first Red Scare. It's by no means the first, but you still hear a lot of people talking about it today, and how terrible it is and how much they're afraid of it. All right. Ultimately, the sort of effects of the Great War, there's some domestic changes, obviously as a result of women having been in the workforce and then women getting the right to vote. Some domestic changes in terms of blacks moving and migrating and getting some new opportunities. And then obviously sort of this rising repetitive fear of communism. All right, so that is chapter 22. Whoa. You've got a quiz tonight. Okay. You will have nothing tomorrow, so tomorrow will essentially be a